All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to the weekly roundup here, American Prospect. I'm David Dayen, your host and executive editor. And with me, I have the newest member of the American Prospect staff, Emma Janssen, our new writing fellow. Emma, how you doing?
I'm doing very well. I am live from Chicago right now, and this is, I think, the end of my third week here. So I'm very happy to be on the live stream.
Exciting, exciting. Yeah, so you are in Chicago from just recent graduate of the University of Chicago.
Yep.
And you've been doing a couple things for us early on here in the process, and we'll start talking about those right quick. But off the bat, we actually have one question I want to quickly address, and then the second question we'll get to a little bit later. But we had an early question about what threat do the FDIC and SEC face with the latest court decisions. Are commissions better off than departmental regulatory functions? This is from Constance. I'm actually doing some reporting on sort of uh, where we go from here after the decision that struck down Chevron deference, which enabled regulatory agencies to get the benefit of the doubt from courts on their statutory interpretations. There's actually a lot Congress can do. The short answer is that everything that the courts did in their various rulings as far as regulatory matters were concerned are all things that Congress has the ability and even duty, I would say, to counteract. And they do it. They can do it in a variety of ways. One by simply reaffirming the statutory interpretations, but also by the way in which they write legislation and the way in which that legislation can make clear their statutory procedures. I actually wrote a piece today that I think speaks to this a little bit. There was a court ruling in a case. It's actually a Chicago-based case, Emma. There was a company called Townstone Financial. It's a lender,
Okay.
like a non-bank mortgage lender, and they
Mhm.
run this infomercial called the Townstone Financial Show, and that's where they get most of their applications from. And it's
Mm.
an unbelievably racist podcast. It
Oh my
calls
God.
the towns, it calls areas of Chicago like jungle areas, and it's absolutely horrible, right?
Oh my
And so the
God.
CFPB sued them. The CFPB, even when it was under Trump, sued them. Like that's how
Mm.
egregious this was, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I
And
see.
a and a federal judge in the Chicago area actually invalidated this because that judge said, well, actually, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which is supposed to guard against racial discrimination, what it says is it talks about applicants, and this was discouraging people from applying, so that wouldn't apply to this. And essentially, if you think about that, if you sort of rationalize that through, reason it through, it would mean that you would be allowed to put a whites only sign out in front of your store, and you wouldn't, because that would discourage people from coming in and applying for credit, so that wouldn't be
Mhm.
covered under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which is totally ridiculous, right? So
That's insane.
CFPB appealed it. It went up to a three-judge panel of three Republican judges. I should say the judge that ruled this initially at the district court level was a Democratic judge. It was a judge that Dick Durbin praised when he came in. Then it went to the appellate court, the Seventh Circuit. Three Republican appointed judges by Reagan, by George H.W. Bush, and by George W. Bush. And they all said, no, this is ridiculous. Read the statute. It says that prospective applicants in the regulation explicitly are, if you discriminate against them, then you are violating the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And but what's interesting is they invoked Chevron. They invoked this decision that the
Mm.
Supreme Court made on Chevron, the Loper Bright case, and they said, "Yeah, but I'm just reading the statute itself and what Congress said, and what Congress has repeatedly said in their amendments to the ECOA and in the initial legislative actions and the committee hearings on the ECOA. And you can see that this is what they wanted to do. They wanted to any aspect of the acquisition of credit, if it's discriminatory in any way, then that would violate the law. And so what you see there is that committees need to be more involved. They need to, and what they did in the ECOA in the 1970s when it was passed is they gave a specific grant of authority to the regulatory agency in very specific language. And during the legislative deliberations on it, they said in there, we want to borrow this language from the Truth in Lending Act because we know this will beat litigation. In other words, they knew that courts were going to come after them for this, and they said, here's the bulletproof language, and we're going to put this in. So Congress needs to do more things like that. Make sure that the laws that they pass aren't a waste of time that are simply going to be overturned by judges. So that's a very long-winded way of answering your question, Constance.
Wow.
Okay.
Wow. That is, sorry, I'm still processing. That is shocking. The Chicago issue with that.
Townstone Financial. You should look up the Townstone Financial podcast.
I am going
radio
to.
show, I believe. But anyway, let's get into some of the stuff you've been working on, so I can shut up and we can hear from a real reporter. So you did something this week, actually, about the Biden administration's climate record, based on some information that you got from Evergreen, which is a really close advisor and a major player sort of in the various climate debates that have happened over the last few years. What did you find out?
Yes. So Evergreen is, like you said, David, really important climate group. They were formed in kind of the aftermath of Governor Inslee's campaign to make sure that some of the climate policies he put forward would be adopted by whoever ended up getting the nomination, which of course was Joe Biden. So they cared a lot about a lot of the climate provisions that we all know and could name off the top of our heads. So things like creating a climate workforce, like a climate corps modeled after the Civilian Conservation Corps back in the New Deal days, things like green banking and grant programs, things like,
the stuff
union
that was in
jobs.
The Inflation Reduction Act, the stuff that was
exactly.
in the various, and some of the regulatory maneuvers that the EPA has done, things like that.
Yeah. So basically what happened is Evergreen has now done a kind of little survey or report on how well they think Biden has done at actually incorporating their demands and their propositions and proposals into his policy. So overall, it was a very flattering report. And, we can't ignore the fact that it's coming out at a pretty intense time for Biden, where anything that is complementary to his presidency and his campaign is extremely important. So they basically overall, they said, Biden has essentially what I guess my recently graduated brain is saying it's a B, which is good. He got an 85%. He has started or completed 85% of the climate change policies that they proposed.
Yeah.
So
not bad. 85 is pretty good in politics.
Yeah, exactly. Something that we were talking about while I was writing this, though, is the fact that, the grading is relative, right? This is a report that they themselves put out, and they are not.
And they were instrumental in creating some of these policies, working with the Biden administration. So this is like getting an 85 from your TA who you're friends with.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's the perfect metaphor. Yeah. So it's not, we're not saying that this is a completely objective thing, but when you get down into the weeds and you look at some of the policies that they specifically shouted out in this report that just came out, there are some really there's some really good news.
Hmm.
I mean, I think one thing that stood out to me was the focus on environmental justice that is kind of ascendant in the last few years. I think people are now thinking about the intersections between climate change and the environment alongside racial and class disparities. That's something that wasn't always really prominent in like major political discourse, and I think it's great that it is now. So um, Biden committed to 40% of 40% of spending on climate would go specifically to climate issues that are impacting disadvantaged
Right.
communities. So we have
Right.
that, right? There were a
That's
couple of
called the
offices.
Justice 40 initiative,
Yeah,
right? Yeah. Hmm.
exactly. Justice 40. Then we also had a couple of councils and agencies and kind of like subgroups within both the White House and the EPA that formed specifically to look at environmental justice initiatives. So I think that's, that's great.
Yeah.
Uh, I think I'd be interested in seeing exactly what those groups have accomplished, more so than just the
Right.
fact that they were formed. But
That they exist.
I'm
Yeah.
not, yeah, I'm
Well,
not
look,
complaining that they exist.
we in 2019, as far back as even before the Biden administration
Mm-hmm.
prospect, we did a series called the Day One Agenda, which looked
Mm-hmm.
at the kinds of things that the president, any president, can do on their own with existing authority from Congress. You know,
Yep.
unless the courts intervene, right? But with existing authority from Congress,
Mm-hmm.
and whether they would get it done. So we outlined a lot of these steps, and a lot of them were about
Mm-hmm.
climate. And the Biden administration has taken up that ball and ran with it. And I think they have understood the need for executive action in some instances. And I mean, with respect to climate, obviously, a lot of this comes from the big legislative package they put together
Yep.
in the IRA, and that is certainly at risk if there's a change in power, particularly in a government that is all on the side of the Republicans. I mean, obviously, this thing passed through the reconciliation process, didn't need to overcome a filibuster, and wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
need to overcome a filibuster on the other side if it was reversed. So there's certainly a risk of some of these climate investments, in particular, things that were done through the tax code. There's a risk that they'll
Yeah.
go away, and so I think that's the thing to take away there. Well, very good. I want to get into something that you're sort of just embarking on,
Cooking up.
thing you're
Yeah.
just starting to work on, and it points to one of the other questions we had early in the chat, and it involves
Indeed.
Cori Bush. So just to set the
Yes.
background here, we've seen throughout the primary season, APAC and its allies be a major player in terms of spending in Democratic politics and in primaries. They initially had ambitions of going after a whole host of progressive candidates.
Yep.
Really, when you get down to it, they're going after two. One was Jamal Bowman, who did in fact lose his race to George Latimer just a month ago. And then the other one is coming up. It's in August, and Cori Bush is the Democrat from the St. Louis area, who is the incumbent, has been the incumbent for 2 terms, and her opponent is going to be this guy Wesley Bell, who's a former, I believe, a former prosecutor, maybe city council member. Why don't you tell me about it, because you know more about it than I do.
Yes. Okay. So I think you set it up perfectly. This is coming in the wake of Bowman's loss, which was, I think people were sort of seeing that it was potentially going to happen. There was exorbitant spending against him in his race, but it still is a pretty shocking, and just a big deal that someone
Yeah.
was ousted, and that much money was spent. So Cori Bush's campaign is up next, and she, like you said, is the congresswoman from St. Louis, from the Missouri First District. And one question that we got from Howard
Yeah.
said, I hope you talk to at least one or two people who are actually from St. Louis regarding the primary
Yeah.
in the district, which absolutely, I think that's an excellent point. I'm actually going to be getting on a train down to St. Louis tomorrow morning,
There you go.
where yeah, so I will be there, and I am hoping to
We don't have step,
join.
Howard. We do this. We do this the right way. We're going
Exactly.
into the district. Yes.
Exactly. Like on the ground, boots on the ground. So I'm hoping to join in on some canvassing events. I know that the Bush campaign has some coming up, and then I'll also try to get connected with someone from the Bell campaign, who's her competitor, and just speak to people who are interested in them, who haven't quite made up their minds, who care a lot about Israel, people who don't care at all about Israel. So, yes, definitely planning
Yeah.
to be there and planning to speak to people and get a sense of what is actually important to
Great.
constituents.
Great.
Yeah,
So I mean, here's the thing I would say. I would say a couple things sort of going into this as someone outside the district at
mm-hmm.
the moment. But um, the first thing is that Jamal Bowman's district and Cori Bush's district are quite different.
Very.
They line up very well on the issues, but Jamal Bowman's district was a district that even more so after 2022 redistricting was largely based in Westchester, which
Mm-hmm.
is an affluent community. There's a large pocket of Jewish Americans in that community.
Yeah.
He only won about 54% of the vote in the primary in 2022. He was going up
Mm-hmm.
against two competitors, and so it was fractured. So it looked like he won by a lot, but he was in a precarious position because of his fit for that district, even before this year and before all this spending came in.
Mm-hmm.
Cori Bush's district looks a lot different than that.
Definitely.
It is very much it is St. Louis. Maybe there are some outlying areas beyond St. Louis, but it's largely St. Louis, downtown
Mm-hmm.
inner city St. Louis, and it is much more diverse than Jamal Bowman's district, and so it's a different scenario there.
It is.
So that's the first thing I think to say. The second thing is that whereas Bowman did not have a great deal of support from local electeds, what I keep seeing from Cori Bush's campaign is she's rolling out a lot of endorsements from local electeds, including the mayor of St. Louis, including other local official city council members and things like that,
Yeah.
including local unions. So she has tended to her backyard, I think, in a way that Bowman has not. So I think those things kind of play into the fact that at this point in the race, for Bowman, he was down by 15 points or something like that, and I haven't seen any poll anywhere like that. It looks like a toss-up is the
It
polls that
does.
I've seen, despite a lot of money already in on the side of attacking Cori Bush.
Yeah, we're talking like I think $4 million was the last thing I saw going into advertising against her. And I think that the point on endorsements is really important. We saw some major Democratic leaders in Congress endorse Cori Bush, which isn't unexpected. They tend to endorse incumbents, but
Mm-hmm.
we can also see if they will at all join the campaign in any way. That's something that didn't end up happening for the Bowman campaign. He was endorsed by Democratic leaders in Congress, but they didn't come,
Right. I mean,
necessarily help him out.
I think like there was a late rally by Bernie and AOC, but it wasn't even in the
Oh, yeah.
district. It was like just
Yeah.
outside the district.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we'll see. Bernie endorsed Cori Bush just the other day, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the local elected endorsements are probably more important because it shows she has a bit of a local power base.
The
The other
interesting
thing I would
thing,
say, yeah, no, go ahead.
no, yeah, the I was looking also to see Wesley Bell's endorsements, and he does have a decent number of local endorsements, but he also, when you look at it, and it's pretty accessible on his website, he has a whole endorsements tab just right there. He's getting a lot of mayors from cities that are outside of the district that are endorsing him. and a lot of judges and let's see, yeah, I would say mayors and
Hmm.
it's mostly mayors when I look at it, actually, to be honest. Which is kind of interesting. There are a few other people in the St. Louis County and St. Louis City areas that have
Hmm.
endorsed him, but I do think comparing it to Cori Bush's, I think you're right that she has more of the actual, like within the district, support when you look at endorsements.
Right. Well, Wesley
Yeah.
Bell was a local prosecutor.
Yeah.
He was, he rose with actually through the Ferguson situation
Yeah.
in St. Louis. He, you know, it got into. We wrote about this race actually last November, I
Hmm.
believe. Um, uh, he sort of, it's weird because Cori Bush was an activist, a Ferguson activist as well,
Yep.
and they sort of rose in tandem in sort of
Yeah.
separate channels. And I think what is happening now is he was recruited
Hmm.
by pro-Israel forces to come into the race,
Yep.
and now he's benefiting from millions of dollars. Most of that money, and this is normal for APAC funded
Hmm.
campaigns, most of that money is going towards ads that never mention Israel at all.
Yeah.
That's very typical. But the big talking point is a talking point that was also used against Jamal Bowman, and we should
Hmm.
probably unpack it a little bit because it's important. So the one ad that I've seen put on by the United Democracy Project, which is APAC's super PAC,
Yeah.
basically, is entirely about a vote that was done in 2021 where Cori
Hmm.
Bush, Jamal Bowman, and a few other progressive Democrats voted against the final vote on the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And that eventually did become law. And the obviously, in the course of a 30-second ad, the nuance of what that vote was about is completely lost. It's a total gotcha. But
Yeah.
uh, the um, the reality of it was that if you remember back to 2021, there were two bills. There was the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which was mostly just infrastructure spending, top up of current infrastructure spending on roads, bridges, ports, things of that nature, the electric grid. And there was the Build Back Better bill that would eventually
Hmm.
become the Inflation Reduction Act. That's the one that had all the climate investments. At the time, it had elder care, it had child care, it had universal pre-K, it had housing benefits, it had healthcare stuff,
Hmm.
all the things around prescription drug negotiation through Medicare. All of that was in the second bill. And
Hmm.
progressives wanted to keep those two bills basically linked because they didn't believe that centrists would pass one. If they got the infrastructure thing, which they wanted, they didn't feel like the other one would ever pass.
Yeah.
And so there was this tactical kind of move to make sure those bills were linked together. And that
Hmm.
held for a while. And then late in 2021, centrists made their moves. Pelosi sided with them, and they put the bill up, the infrastructure bill alone. And it was going to pass because it had the votes to pass, but sort of symbolically, in a way to sort of express dissent with the delinking of these two bills, a handful of progressives voted against that. They didn't threaten the bill. The bill was going to pass.
Hmm.
They just voted against it. Now, none of that nuance is in this ad whatsoever because the nature of these ads are they're just saying Cori Bush voted against infrastructure for you and your families and blah 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 blah
Yeah.
blah. So I think that's something that it might be interesting when you go down there to talk to voters about is
Yeah.
whether they understand that at all, because they probably do not. They probably have no
Yeah.
idea about this, sort of inside Washington machination. Now, it should be said that eventually the Inflation Reduction Act does pass, but it's
Yep.
severely slimmed down. So the progressives weren't entirely wrong here, right? Like
Yeah.
they did cut this. First of all, that bill almost never passed at all because Joe Manchin kind of balked at it. But when he finally came around, it was written entirely on his terms. And
Mhm.
so we got the climate stuff and we got some of the healthcare stuff. We got nothing else. And so I think, it's important to understand that the stand that progressives were taking was legitimate
Yeah.
because it ended up being a situation where we did not get what was in that bill to begin with.
Yeah. So I'll be curious to see if, people on the ground, first of all, if they know about those votes and if that argument and those ads have been convincing, and if that question of, is Cori Bush voting against infrastructure bills that would benefit my life, is that something that people are really considering right now? And if they are, do they know the nuance behind it, like you said? So that's definitely something I'll be asking about. Um, and then just another, to go back to what you said about their kind of parallel rise during the Ferguson protest. I mean, I think it's interesting. I don't know if this has been a major part of Wesley Bell's campaign, but he at least mentions pretty prominently on his website. I think it's the second sentence on his description of himself. He's the son of a police officer. He's a prosecutor. And so I think it'll be interesting to see how uh, criminal justice might come up and the issues of policing, especially because Cori Bush on her website discusses being, I believe, a victim of police brutality herself, and
Right.
growing up around police brutality, just in her community with people she loves. So that's another thing that, isn't necessarily at the fore right now. There's a lot of talk about Israel and infrastructure, but I am really
Right.
interested to see how that plays out.
Criminal justice reform would be interesting. It'd be interesting to see if people talk about the eviction moratorium. One of the really interesting things
Yeah,
Cori Bush did when she first got to Congress was she held a sit-in on the steps of Congress to
yeah,
protest the Biden administration attempting to take away what was an eviction moratorium during the pandemic. That ended up being successful. She got that extended. Ultimately, here we go with the courts again. The courts nullified that eviction moratorium. But I think that her style of leadership, which was really
mhm,
kind of activist based, had an impact there, at least on the margins, with that particular policy. And so, it'd be interesting to see
yeah,
how people react to that. Okay, I want to go to another question from the chat. This is
yes,
from Chris from Chicago, and it's for you, Emma. Just curious, would the climate course survive a Trump presidency? And he references Rob Meyer's heat map piece called
mhm,
Biden's Imperiling a Tremendous Climate Legacy. And that gets into sort of Biden running, which we can talk about after that. But, what do we think the stakes are there in terms of the
yeah,
climate core, which, we can talk about the fact that it's right now embedded into the AmeriCorps program, which is an existing
yes,
program, and it's using
exactly.
existing funds. But the Biden administration had to say, yeah, we're going to make the American Climate Corps part of that, and anything a
Send
president
funds
can
over to
do,
this. Yeah,
right? Anything a president can do, they can probably take away, right?
yeah. I mean, I haven't done specific research on this, so this is a super interesting question, Chris from Chicago. But my instinct is that yes, if funding was allocated to create this climate subsection of AmeriCorps, funding can be taken away from it. This wasn't like, this wasn't creating an entire new agency. I'm not really sure what the best counterexample
Yeah,
would be, but in my understanding, this is a federal moving of funds, and that to me seems like a very
right.
vulnerable thing that could be taken away.
Yeah, I mean, it was an executive prerogative is the answer. Like, there's no legislative sort of statute behind it. The AmeriCorps program is funded, and presumably it would continue on. Uh, the American Climate Corps is kind of a small part of AmeriCorps. It's really, we're
Yeah,
talking about 20,000 new jobs. The initial
yeah,
vision for the civilian Climate Corps as a separate agency was something like 300,000 jobs. So it's a very
yeah,
small program. And the Biden and Harris administration had to say, we're going to put this into AmeriCorps. Like, that's how it got done. So,
yeah,
I don't see Trump just saying, okay, well, let's keep that going. I'm big
yeah,
on climate. So yes, I mean, these things are contingent, things that are based on certain executive actions. uh, it's now. I mean, I will say that it's possible that you could see, just like you have seen litigation throughout the Biden administration by right wing attorneys general or right wing groups. If certain things attempt to be defunded or if certain interpretations change, then those can be challenged in court by liberal groups. And we saw that throughout the Trump administration, by the way, because they didn't typically engage in the rulemaking process in the correct fashion through notice and comment, administrative procedure. So those opportunities remain available. It's just the shoes on the other foot. And so, I don't know that necessarily corresponds to the American Climate Corps, but what it does mean is that it will take some time for Trump to wring these out of the system. And if he doesn't do it right, they could be maintained.
Yeah, I think that's good.
All right.
But yeah, it's scary. It's really scary.
Well, Emma, let's switch gears here. You're in Chicago. We're all going to be in Chicago in about a month's time for the Democratic National Convention. We have no idea what awaits us at the Democratic National Convention.
Yep.
We don't know if we're going to be witnessing the nomination of a president for a second term or somebody else.
Yep.
2 weeks ago, I wouldn't have said that, but obviously the debate has caused this major shift within the party. We haven't really talked about that. Obviously, we had a press conference yesterday that we can get into a little bit, but I'm wondering what your general thoughts are. Forget about as a journalist, but as someone who watched the debate and watched sort of how this process has evolved, how this situation I would maybe call debacle has evolved over the last 2 weeks. Just what are your initial thoughts about where this thing is going?
Okay, so a few initial thoughts. I watched the debate with some friends and it was really difficult to watch. I mean, I think that's a pretty common experience. It was like I felt like hiding my face in my hands a couple of times, more than a couple of times. And I think one thing that actually did scare me, I know we've heard a lot of Democrats, liberals, leftists in the weeks since the debate trying to shift a little bit of the focus more towards Trump and his performance. People saying, listen to how much he was lying. I heard someone just the other day say Trump gave the second worst debate performance in history, but no one's talking about it. And actually, I disagree. I think I was quite scared by how well I thought Trump was doing. I mean, yes, he was lying out of his teeth, but he had a sense of composure that I am not necessarily used to him having, that I think looks very different from his last two campaigns. So I think as much as Biden was the focus of my discontent, I was also nervous about how I think Trump has spent the past 3-4 years learning from his mistakes. So that's one thought that that's just feels really, really bad. I think he looked way better and dare I say, potentially more presidential than Biden did on the debate stage, which is horrible. And I never thought I'd be saying that. My second thought is that I was also talking to friends and kind of debating what we think should happen, could happen, would happen. And I was surprised to see that a lot of people I was speaking with had little to no faith in Kamala Harris as a candidate or as a president. And I found myself realizing that I actually do have a lot more faith that she could potentially win an election than people thought. I mean, I think a lot of her silly gaffes have gone viral, and because they haven't done it.
Are you saying you're coconut pilled?
I'm coconut pilled. I'm 100% coconut pilled. I'm so I'm a little bit coconut pilled. I think that she actually has the potential in this moment to I mean, people have talked about this. This is not a new idea, but she is a prosecutor. That was a big part of her identity that she had to kind of tamp down on in her primary campaign. Um, but now it might be helpful running against Trump and just in this moment in general, even aside from the
Mhm.
fact that Trump was just convicted of dozens of felonies.
Right.
I also think that when she is given the opportunity to kind of lock in, focus in, and speak for the administration, she does better than people think she does. I think people have a caricature of her in their heads. So I'm slightly coconut pilled. I think that for many reasons, if Biden were to step down or anything were to happen, I would actually feel confident about Kamala as the nominee.
Interesting. Well,
Yeah.
well, one thing I saw today, so a poll came out this morning from NPR and
Mm.
Marist, and the two data points are rather striking. So the first data point is
Mhm.
when you ask voters, do you think that Joe Biden is mentally fit to serve as president for the next 4 years? You get 64% saying no, right? And yet Biden is winning the head to head against Trump. 50 to 48. So
Yep.
if you do the math on that, it means one out of every four people who said literally Joe Biden is unfit to serve is voting for him over Donald Trump. And
Yep.
it shows how these two candidates in some way, I don't want to say they deserve each other, but
But they kind of
nobody
deserve each other.
they kind of do. Like no, there's nobody Trump could beat except for Biden, and there's nobody Biden could beat except for Trump. There is
Yeah.
there is part of the whole tendency here. Part of the race is has to account for that, so that
Yeah.
look. I think the general consensus is that Joe Biden had an absolutely disastrous debate performance that sowed all these existing doubts in the electorate that his age would be a hindrance on him serving in this office for 4 years. And what happened? Even the most pessimistic person would tell you the polls have dropped by 2 points, right? So all that, like this horribly disastrous debate performance, and we've got a 2 point change in the polls.
Yeah.
It shows how polarized the country is, and it also shows how
Exactly.
Donald Trump has his own issues with the electorate that are not going to be wiped away, no matter who he's running against, dead or alive. And
Yeah.
so that's, I think, one part of it. I think that may speak to your point about if you replace, I mean, there's no doubt that after a year of the electorate looking with dread at having to make this choice between these two people who they have very concrete feelings about, that if
Mhm.
you suddenly say, oh no, we're going to replace one with somebody new, and it doesn't matter who that is at this point, but just we're not going to give you this Hobson's choice anymore. We're not going to give you this choice between these two old men. Uh, any change there is going to result, I think, at least at the outset, in a bounce for that candidate, because
Mhm.
you've now unlocked the box that everybody thought they were in for so long here, and so I think that speaks to the potential of a Kamala Harris, the potential of a whoever else it is, and then the messiness of the process, the individuals involved in the process, all point toward the only kind of outlet for this. Whether you're talking about the campaign funds, whether you're talking about all of the other factors, you got to look at Kamala Harris as having a leg up there.
Yeah.
So on those points, I see your coconut pillhood very well. So
Thank you.
anyway, uh, so yeah, I mean, as far as I don't know if you took a look. There was this press conference yesterday about NATO. Uh, it was 2 hours late. from what it was
Yeah.
supposed to be. I had a dinner party, and I had to like say, "Come over later," because I got to watch this debate or this press conference. I think everybody was like looking for this sign out of the sky, like
Yeah.
hopefully Joe Biden will either fall off the podium or recite the Gettysburg Address from memory. And then
Yep.
I'd have a clear option, I could either say
Exactly.
yes or go. And the world doesn't work like that, right? I
Yep.
mean, there's no way in which it was just going to give you the divine answer
Yeah.
from this press conference. I think it was fine. It was
Yeah.
he had a couple stumbles, and also he seemed to know what the basic issues were. So
Yeah.
that put us in sort of the worst case scenario, which is everybody is sort of in that middle position now of figuring out whether this is a dog we're watching,
We
by the
have a
way. Yeah.
third
Hi,
guest.
we
Yeah,
have a
I was trying
third
to figure it
guest.
out.
This is Olive.
He doesn't know
Anyway,
anything about Joe Biden or open
no,
convention.
I think she's not going to have much to add to the conversation. But anyway, point being, well, did you watch the press conference? Let's start there.
Only bits and pieces. I didn't watch it straight through, but I saw
Mhm.
some of the like better parts, clips of some of the better parts, and clips of some of the worst parts. And I guess my take is pretty much exactly like yours, which is that every time since the debate that Biden has tried to, like save his campaign, whether it be in he had the interview with Morning Joe
Right.
or any interview, this press
George
conference, everything.
Stephanopoulos, this, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. It's always been kind of this horrible middle ground where like
Right.
there's not any concrete answer. And so I think
It
it's
wasn't good enough to vanquish the critics, and it wasn't bad
yeah,
enough to get everybody on board, which is like the worst
exactly.
case scenario, the most
Because
annoying
nobody's gonna
scenario.
do
And so, of
anything.
course, what happened? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. We're just
My
gonna keep
my
marching on.
view my view of politics over the last 8 years is that the most annoying thing is the thing that happens, right? So the most
Yeah.
annoying thing is that there's no answer. There's no
Yeah.
clear answer, and therefore we just keep going on. Now, there was a theory that a multitude of Democratic members of the House were going to come out as soon
Mhm.
as NATO left
Mm,
the scene, as soon as the world leaders went back home, that they were going to come out and say Biden can't continue. We've seen a
mhm.
couple. There were a couple right after the press
Yeah.
conference, and then I think one more today. But it hasn't been a flood
No.
that was as hoped, and maybe that's because he had a decent enough performance there, and so, but I mean, the whole thing is based on this false premise, the idea that someone can go up and just sort of nail it and then quiet critics is,
Yeah.
is is just not how the world works, and especially it's not how it works when you have this sort of defining moment.
Yeah.
I would put the debate under the category of one of those moments where you can't just sort of unring that. Joe Biden
No.
is not Benjamin Button. He's not going to get younger as he goes on. And so, the way the electorate processes that is he didn't look good. He was rambling. He wasn't making a lot of sense, and that's going to get worse throughout the
Yeah.
next 4 years. And there is no way to convince people otherwise that aging will somehow happens to
Not
all of us,
happen.
but not to him. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's the big problem there.
It like
Uh,
overall, I
mhm.
think it does just make me a little sad. Like this is an old man who's done a lot of service to the country, and um, it is really unfortunate that what we're doing is making jokes about his age on Twitter or X
Right.
instead of praising him or even debating his legacy. You don't have to praise Joe Biden to I just it's
Right.
up to him. It's his decision that that's why this is happening. But I wish he would have made a different
Well,
decision.
and the other thing is, yeah, and the other thing is, Joe Biden in that press conference says corporate profits have gotten too high, and it's time we do something about that. And I don't think there would be a candidate who would come out of this very donor-led process of changing nominees who would be willing to say that or confront capital in any way. I mean,
Mm,
what we
mhm,
get lost from when we start talking about the sort of political skills of a particular candidate, we lose the policy. We lose what
mm,
that candidate is actually doing, what their record is, and what their record would be going forward.
mhm,
And it is undeniable that Joe Biden has installed a group of people who are doing very good and intelligent work and transformative work at the various agencies. I'm talking about the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. I'm talking about the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I'm talking about the National Labor Relations Board. I'm talking about the Antitrust Division of the Justice Department, not really the other divisions of the Justice Department, but certainly the Antitrust Division, and several others, where they really are challenging corporate power in a way that is new over the last 50 years. And I think that if you get into a process where donors, by shutting off the money spigot, are dictating who the nominee is going to be, it's going to be very hard to maintain those officials at those agencies under a new Democrat brought in on the sales of a lot of rich people.
mm.
So I think that's part of this, and it's been sort of very, very, very far under the surface. We haven't
Definitely.
really talked about it, and we've talked about affect and theater criticism,
Yeah.
and all these other things, but we haven't talked about that base part of this. And it doesn't. You can hold two things in your head at one time: that
Yeah.
Joe Biden's a flawed candidate who may not have the capacity to serve another 4 years, and has brought serious doubts, if not in governing, in the ability to mount a rigorous campaign against Donald Trump. You can say that. You can also say that there are ulterior motives,
Mhm.
perhaps, to moving Joe Biden off the scene, and any kind of replacement process might not get the same results. So I think that's
Mm.
important. I think it's an important thing to just lay out and stress.
Yeah, I
Okay.
agree.
All right. I want to go back. There was another comment that we missed,
Yes.
that I want to roll back on from Jared,
We can
who,
inject some levity by talking about fossil fuels.
yeah, yeah, right. Yeah, this is going to be a lot more fun, especially because of what it is. He said he noticed the LNG export suspension or pause was lifted by a federal judge in Louisiana, which is true, and that's actually in your story.
It is.
So, I mean, this is one of the reasons why just a scorecard doesn't tell everything, because, as I
Yeah.
understand it, in the Evergreen, you can explain this further, but in the
Mhm.
Evergreen report card, they gave Biden credit for pausing new uh, 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 licenses for LNG export terminals.
Exactly. So, for those who don't know, LNG is liquefied natural gas. And basically, that's just cooling natural gas so intensely, like very, very cold, so that it becomes a liquid, which makes it possible to transport, whether that be,
Right.
I don't know, through pipes or on across the seas,
Right.
etc.
Mostly
Um,
on tankers and going across the country or
yeah.
around the
And
world.
I think we sell like so first of all, the US is the world's biggest exporter of LNGs, and I think we sell like 50% of ours to Europe. So that I think that's what I saw, something like that.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
essentially, the Biden administration, as Evergreen said and gave them credit for, they did pause this licensing process to basically allow new exporters and new exports of LNG, right? So they were essentially saying,
Yes,
hey, we need to look at this data and figure out the impacts of LNG, the harms of LNG
on
before we
climate.
let
Yeah,
new people, exactly, before we let new people
right.
start exporting it
And
out.
that's an important distinction, because we're talking about is
Yes.
new LNG export terminals. the existing terminals we have and the expected
Yeah.
capacity that they would have to export would make us the world leader in LNG exports long into the future, even
Yeah.
though we exported zero LNG materials as recently as 2016. The LNG export ban only
Mm.
lifted then. And within an 8-year period, we became the number one exporter in the world of
Yeah.
LNG. And that would continue even under this pause, because this is only
Exactly.
about new terminals to expand capacity even further. However,
Exactly.
as Jared said,
Yes.
that was blocked by a federal judge.
Yes.
And
So
so Evergreen is giving credit to the Biden administration for something that ultimately is not in place right now.
yeah, exactly. So 16 Republican-led states essentially said, hey, they put forth a legal challenge to this blocking of new licenses, um, and or the pause of new licenses. And a judge then struck down the pause and essentially said, hey, you can't actually pause this until we've figured out this legal challenge from the 16 states. And so
Right, right. They put an
yeah,
injunction on it. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. So
So
that
got
injunction
it.
came July 1st. So we're, yeah, a week and a
So
half
we're
out
so
from
we're
that.
in limbo there, and of course, this is a major priority of the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, who happens to be from Louisiana, which is a major
Mhm.
LNG export state. Yeah, we'll have to kind of see what happens there. Certainly, there are other grounds by which the Department of Energy and other departments that handle both the LNG export terminals and also the pipelines that take natural gas from where it is found
Mhm.
to those export terminals. Um, there are the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, the Department of Energy, all have
Mhm.
oversight over this and have the ability to determine whether or not they're going to go forward with these various things, pipelines and things like that. So it isn't the last word. Just because this
Yes.
export suspension was blocked, it isn't the last word. There are still processes by which this can take place, and
Exactly.
natural gas is seen as a sort of bridge fuel to renewable
Mhm.
energy because it's cleaner than coal, but it still emits some fossil fuels.
Yep.
And so the idea from supporters of it have always been, well, you have to let us do this so that we have a bridge to, the day when we have all renewables, all,
Mhm.
solar, wind, nuclear, whatever,
Yeah.
hydroelectric. The sort of rebuttal to that is that if you are building a bunch of export terminals,
Yeah.
pipelines, other infrastructure that is put in place, the people who own that are going to have a tremendous interest in keeping it going.
Yes.
In They're not going to want those assets to be stranded. They don't want to build a
No.
bridge. they want to
No.
build they want to build a
A
highway,
wealth.
and they want to keep that
Yeah.
highway going as much as they possibly can. And so,
Yeah.
putting this infrastructure in place may lock in a certain number of fossil fuel emissions for the
Exactly.
long term in a way that would be disadvantageous to the climate. So that's the debate.
And we are already on track to, if we keep going at the rate that we're going in terms of LNG export, we're on track to double our export by the end of the decade, which is 6 years away. And it's really hard to fathom. And just as a last note on this, I guess, to put in the stakes, essentially the concerns with LNG export, of course, there is a kind of global risk that I think we all probably know well, which is methane emissions primarily. That is a greenhouse gas. And so it does all of the bad things to our atmosphere that we all know so well, which is causing global
Right.
warming, climate.
And I and I mean that's part of the reason that the Department of Energy put this pause in the first place. They're like, we got to
Exactly.
get a
Yeah,
handle on understanding the extent of these methane emissions, the
exactly.
extent of the real impact, not the alleged impact that industry talks about, but the real
Hmm.
impact in terms of
Yeah.
climate, in terms of CO2 emissions on the from increasing those exports by those degrees that you're talking about. And so,
Yeah,
I think they were basically saying, look, we have to understand the science before we can go forward with putting in this lasting infrastructure.
exactly. Exactly.
The judge said, no, you're not allowed to do that. But it's kind of a funny ruling because the Department of Energy is well within its rights to study climate impacts.
Yeah,
So, we'll have to see. Obviously, that's going to be appealed. We're
yeah,
obviously it's in Louisiana. We're talking about the Fifth Circuit. It's a very right wing circuit. It's going to be unlikely that that will be lifted at the circuit court level, and then maybe it'll go up to the Supreme Court, which also is problematic. So,
yeah,
I mean, we'll see what ends up happening with this, but
yeah.
it's another example of how we've become this juristocracy where the work of the courts has become the work of policy writ large, and it's incumbent upon the other two branches to reestablish some of their authority to rebalance what has become a really judicial-led government. So
And you can check prospect.org/environment for any and all follow-ups to
look
any
at
and all
that.
appeals that end up happening.
Wow, that's
I know, right?
tremendous. Very good. On as a first timer here, getting in the throw to the links, the promotional
Exactly.
ability.
Exactly.
Well, excellent job, Emma Janssen. Thank you for being on the show today. We
Thank
do this
you.
every week, as you know, with different members of our staff and maybe special guests sometimes. We post this on our website at prospect.org, so you'll be able to take a look at this afterwards. And we come to you every week, this time, 12:30 Eastern on Fridays. I'm not going to be here next Friday, so we'll have probably Ryan Cooper in the chair here with a guest, of member of our staff. So that'll be next Friday, but I'll be back after that. And of course, we have the Republican convention next Friday, or next week, actually, all week. And we'll have ongoing coverage next week of the convention. We're going to have a couple people on the ground at the Republican convention. So we'll be giving you dispatches at prospect.org on that. And also, we're going to be at the Democratic convention. We're going to be there. We have, I think, 4 different reporters who are going to be at the Democratic convention in Chicago, August 19th to the 22nd. So keep checking back on prospect.org for that as well. And that's about all we have today. So Emma, thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was great. And thank you, everyone who asked a question. They were wonderful.
Yes, really appreciate that. And you'll be able to find Emma's work throughout the next 2 years as a writing fellow here at the Prospect. So keep on coming back, and have a great rest of your day and a great weekend. Take care.